始め！
Greetings and salutations, honored legionaries. It's General Lance once again, Sergeant Barnes, and we're here with a transmission for Technica. I have been ruminating a lot recently, especially because in the last year, 2 years or so, I'm sure many of you legionaries have been taking note and keeping appraised of, let's say, modern conflicts happening. The revolution in military affairs, or as it's called, which is a continuous thing, right? It's not just this static being. We no longer live in an era where there's a relatively one-for-one change between eras and, one epic follows the other in a kind of subtle way. So, for instance, what I'm talking about is, the change between decades can be as vast as in antiquity, the change between millennia. And what I mean is, of course, the Roman Empire, for the longest time, ruled by heavy infantry, packed in neatly ordered condition, and then transitioning over to a more cavalry-focused technology only after hundreds of years, right, with the invention of the stirrup, or at least not the invention of the stirrup, but rather its mechanization, its widespread use, its diffusion, and so on. So there's technological innovation, and there's diffusion of technology itself. And so the interesting thing to me is, the change between us today and the Cold War era, as it is probably best exemplified by the Persian Gulf War, but even prior to that, of course, it's the era of airland battle, which is this one and the same thing, right? So 1991 was the culmination of this kind of technique of war, this doctrinal preference of war. And then, of course, you keep on going back, and you have, first, I guess it's third generation, second generation, first generation, and so on. Everything is continuing to accelerate. The advent of AI, cheaper computer parts, industrial supply chains, and less intensive smart munitions, or less industrially intensive smart munitions, the plenitude of advanced technologies like, basically microprocessors and all the good stuff that you already know about, especially if you're a Zoomer. And so ultimately, it's really interesting because ultimately, I would consider myself to be a pretty erudite study of the military arts and sciences, and to be frank with you, and I continuously canvass the soldiery of the world and officership of the world, and I read what they're experiencing and the various different conflicts that exist. And what's interesting to me is that it is advancing at such a quick pace that it is difficult to understand the tether, or rather the central axiom of what is the center of gravity of the battlefield today. Because a lot of people make the mistake of thinking that FPVs, the advent of effectively perfect ISR, which is, for those of you who don't understand what ISR is, it's effectively the command and control function that gives the command leadership all the way down to the small unit level to, corps command, theater command, and so on, a play-by-play perfect understanding of the battlefield as it stands. In effect, it's World War I's wet dream, right? It's the French High Command's wet dream on the Western Front. But, of course, that's impossible back then, but now it's becoming even more possible And here's the understated element of the emergent technologies which will be decisive in the future. And this technology has a lot less to do with any one specific aspect or technique, but rather the integration of all of a state's body politic capabilities, both civilian and military and government. You know, and in the West, all these things are separate in our eyes, but the integration of these into a cogent whole for a whole of state effort. And remember, when I say state, what I'm saying is ultimately, you know, it's not just the government, as Americans would call it. It's not just the military. It's not just the elected officials. It's not just the civilians and citizens which make part of that state, or the economic assets, whether it's GDP or GNP, hard capital, fiscal stuff, everything, absolutely everything, from human capital all the way down. It's, when I say state, it is the holistic term. And this is important because ultimately, going into the future, what we're going to start seeing, as I'll elucidate here soon, is the whole of state integration and mobilization in state efforts across the world. And those states which are able to more perfectly and more wholly integrate all of their actions into one cogent effort is going to win the day. And also somehow retain the dynamism of basically small unit leadership and small unit initiative. And this doesn't just extend to the military, but writ large in the civilian world, you know, in enterprise, in technological advancement, and so on. But here's the challenge, right? In the West, we have the antithetical issue. In the Far East, you know, China, Russia, a lot of these Asiatic countries, they focus on centralizing the state, and effectively it's very top-down, very vertical command and control system. And this is writ large, whether it's civilian, whether it's government, whether it's military. And the Cold War really highlighted a lot of these vulnerabilities. And so since the fall of the Soviet Union, many of these polities have learned from their mistakes and imbibed to themselves. So they've retained the centralized modes of things, but also given more latitude and therefore dynamism to their basically component parts, whether it's civilian, military, government, elsewise, while still maintaining the unity of principle. In the West, we have the opposite problem. In the West, our government is decentralized. There's no one really in charge of the government. It's why America, for instance, is so porous to foreign influence. I'm not going to comment on what governments or what interest groups are most influential at this time, but suffice it to say, we understand that there are competing interests. And the reason why is because of this, I suppose it's cultural, but also it is a product of, it's a conscious product of the liberal program, which is decentralization, basically flattening of the social structure, emphasizing dynamism and the robustness of allowing a circulation of both elites and the basically the handover of political power, but also economic power, as well as everything else. However, that worked great when America was in isolation, when the distances between nations for the United States, and this is called force projection, but really it's geospatial pressures, right? So, and just to elucidate what I mean, geospatial distance matters, right? So remember in the 1800s, America was a far-off country, very competent. It didn't have really any natural enemies, aside from the British, of course, which threatened its sovereignty, and the British were embroiled in the Napoleonic Wars, in the various wars of empire and so on, and so it never was really a threat. And of course, when the French were kicked out of Mexico, with Maximilian I being effectively executed by Juarez and so on, ultimately, what does this mean? Is that America developed in an environment with no pressures which demand centralized control. Its ethnic populace was relatively homogeneous. Now, in a polity, it's important to understand, especially in republics, homogeneity of populace is a requisite to cohesion of a republican polity, right? So, and the reason why is, of course, as we're finally finding out, and it's the reason why liberalism is collapsing, is that we understand that different cultural spheres and their biological creations are very starkly different from one another. The way that they act in environments maintain themselves regardless of their professed ideology. And with the sweeping away of the old order, right, the European-led order, the distinction between polities, civilizational states, has only increased rather than decreased. Things have not become really homogenized, but rather they have become more starkly contrasted. And so going forward, just to bring it full circle, nowadays with the internet, with nuclear propulsion in this, for instance, in aircraft carriers, force projection of the U.S. Navy, of other countries, mass migration, the facility of porous borders, especially in liberal countries where it's very easy to get a visa into a country and so on. This kind of exchange of populaces, it's very easy to have populations that are hostile to you. So as we're seeing now, there are distinct subsets of, how do I say this delicately, of anti-Americans residing within the United States. And it doesn't matter how many generations they stay, they created communities which in and of themselves are distinct and will maintain their distinctness, right, from the greater populace as a whole, the American populace as a whole. One could even argue that the Irish still haven't had full integration into the American populace because of its petty clannishness and its inability to assimilate to Anglo-Saxon, Anglo-American culture, right? Because that is the cultural body politic. And of course there are exceptions. I'm sure many of you loyal legionaries are not petty patties, or so to speak. But regarding to, at least in the United States, and I myself also, I'm of Irish extraction, so, please spare me. Returning to the point, geospatial pressures have only increased with the proximity of state actors and their proxies, tendrils being felt. Because nowadays, think about it, ballistic missile technology can strike at targets all the way around the world. Hypersonic missile battery systems can reach targets that are, could only be dreamed of in World War II. The distance felt and experienced, leveraged by technology, is closed. And to say nothing, of course, we have many different populaces which are entrenched in the American polity, as we see that they're alien and ultimately are, inimical to the American Republic. And so regardless of whether people hold in their hearts a Republican conviction, ultimately it's leading to a Roman revolution, right? Because the Romans felt exactly the same pressures, both demographically, the widespread of its territories, and therefore it necessitated a cogent command and control, a unity of principle, of political principle, a unity of command. Just like in the military, right? We have a general who's in charge of everyone, everything comes straight down, think of a pyramid. Republics in this environment no longer have effect. And those republics which still do exist are republics in name only. In effect, they are satrapies. So the various republics of Europe are satrapies of either the United States or Russia. See, this is what happens when you drink Jim Beam. You start burping. But anyway, yep. Regardless, what my point is, and, I personally am great with Empire, but, I know many of you Legionaries might not feel so emboldened by it. But unfortunately, or fortunately, it's an inevitability. The future requires a technology, a cultural cohesion, a cultural technology as well, for that whole of state unity of principle in affecting whole of state action elsewhere. So cohesion at home and unity of action abroad. And it's really funny, if you doubt me as far as the divergence of the United States policy throughout the world, the CIA is famously known to be super compartmentalized and with rivaling factions within the United States, for instance, in the State Department. And of course, it's been picked up by the CIA and all other intelligence agencies. They're made of many different factions, everything from far left to far right and everything in between. And that's the trouble with republicanism. For as much as it does foster a diversity of thoughts, a diversity of understanding, it causes the chaos of action. And as we all know in the military, there needs to be a unity of action, right? Basically, a united force, disciplined and cohesive. And this is what China is actually somehow mastered. I'm not here, and I'm not a cinephile, to be frank with you, but there is something interesting in what they did. They were able to either agglomerate or organically introduce into its body politic the technologies which are fruits from liberalism, while still retaining the same positive control over the entire state. And I remember, state is everything from civilians, economics, everything associated with a nation. In the United States, we still haven't felt the pressure and the ability, or necessarily the need, for this kind of innovation. And this has a precedent as well in antiquity. If you remember the Peloponnesian War, the Spartans versus the Athenians, Athens being the democracy, and of course Sparta being an oligarchy with a basically dyad monarchy, which is two families, two kings at one time. And the reason behind that, Legionaries, is because they didn't want to have a tyrant, right? It's very interesting. The Greeks had a lot of interesting innovations. Funnily enough, this is why the Romans had two consuls, to check each other, to keep one from having absolute power, especially after the kings were vanquished. But, as we saw, Athens was only an effective war-fighting state so long as it had a cohesive leadership. And Pericles himself was the reason why he was able to, exact great defeats or victories on both the Spartans and the Persians and so on, and advance the interests of the Athenian city-state abroad into a new empire that was forming as an anti-hegemon to the hegemonic power of Sparta. Sparta, of course, was the hegemon. And remember, this concept of hegemon means basically among many states, one state is preeminent around which the majority of smaller or lesser states orient around. So if you think, for instance, the Cold War, there's the West, the First World and the Second World, and the non-aligned Third World. That's where the terms come from. And so ultimately what happened was the same thing. Pericles dies in a plague. And of course democracy does what democracy does. It causes chaos. Funnily enough, a lot of the self-sabotage which happened in Athens happened because of the democracy. There was one battle, the naval battle, where the victorious admirals, the Athenians were victorious at sea against the Spartans and against, their proxies at least. And what happened was they lost some of their men at sea, And the custom had been that you had to recover their bodies and bury them with full honorary rights in the patria. And the people were, of course, as the people are, changeable, mercurial, given to the passions, not governed by reason. And so, despite the fact that these admirals were victorious and necessary for Athens' war effort, they were all summarily basically sentenced to death. I really can't put it anywhere lightly, because of this hysteria which overcomes the people. And remember, you should never respect the demos. The demos are meant to be commanded, and their only virtue is obedience. This is where Plato comes in. And remember, of course, on top of everything else, it was the democracy, which was easily manipulated by Alcibiades' political opponents, which condemned Alcibiades, then the only savior and competent general, leading Athens from victory to victory against the Spartans and their leagues, to basically turn sides. So Alcibiades is like, you know what? I'm not going to be executed by these freaks. So what I'm going to do? I'm going to mess them up. I'm going to go to Sparta. I'm going to fit in. It's really funny, actually. He impregnated Aegeus II's wife. Absolutely cocked him. Is incredible. And he had this facility as a chameleon of an individual. He's a very interesting guy. Just an absolutely enigmatic, but also at the same time galvanizing figure, in which he was able to bring men to him, fit into whatever social mores of whatever city-state he had been. And remember, the distinction was wide. If you go to modern Greece, it doesn't even do it justice. I mean, the difference between city-states is like the difference between today of, let's say, Greece and Turkey. It's very distinct, right? There may be some similarities, and I know I'm going to get a lot of tax for this, but you have to understand this distinction was felt strongly in the fact that he was able to adapt so readily and find popularity in these, let's say, adopted nations for a time. It speaks to his commandership, his ability to lead as a natural leader of men. Regardless, returning to the original point, here's the thing. Alcibiades, because of the democracy, was forced to fight against the Athenians, and obviously you can make any social moral qualms about that, but basically he pushed the Athenians shit in, right? And on top of everything else, the war effort continuously eroded until, of course, the Spartans were victorious. They dismantled the long walls. They undid the power center of Athens, which was its ports, Pelias, I believe. And on top of everything else instituted its form of government, oligarchy, upon the democracy, the heart of democracy. The state of affairs didn't last for very long, but it stands to reason that the story and the lesson is one and the same. That nation, which has a disciplined, whole of state effort, cohesiveness, is able to win. And so democracy inherently is chaotic. It is inherently divisive and inherently given to stupid decisions. Inherently, basically manipulated by sensationalism and yellow paper journalism and whatever it may be. And the issue is, that would be fine so long as the oligarchs in charge of the republics were of one and the same faction. But they're not. There are many different factions. It's not just one or the other. There are Atlanticists, there's, neocons, there's leftists, communists, everything, right? And of course now an emergent patriotic faction, which I strongly support. But regardless, this state of affairs can't last, and this division at home will lead to disaster abroad. That is the technology which most of us don't understand. And this is why ultimately I've actually come to study more of the military doctrine from these states, which had intrinsically, of course, a more hierarchical understanding and more holistic understanding of state warfare, as opposed to being an aspect of a nation state. Now, Obviously, say what you will. Obviously, you know I'm no communist, but it is always right to learn, legionaries, even from the enemy. So, without further ado, going to the most interesting of foreign doctrines which I've come to read. It is not simply, there's a lot of interesting stuff from PRC, unrestricted warfare, and of course I have to do a transmission on that at some point, but until its salience comes to pass, I believe I'll hold off, right, so that way I can have some more cogent and timely contemporary commentary, and, allusions and so on. But I feel like it's important to revisit the Soviets. Now, why the Soviets? I'm not talking about necessarily the communists per se, but this was around the time that military thought in Russia, which had become the Soviet Union, right? Because these are two different things. Ultimately evolved or artificially created a total holistic unity of effort, right? And so, what do I mean by this? Well, basically, before, of course, the imperial system under the Tsars, they were able to mobilize most of its populace. It had a very good mobilization rate. It had a good, this and that and the other thing. But it was, for the first time, in the Soviet era, that they evolved the doctrine that I'm alluding to right now. The technology necessary to ultimately have a whole of state effort. And so this is including of propaganda, psychological warfare, of course. It includes, rudimentary cyber warfare. It includes, political warfare, economic warfare, conventional warfare, nuclear warfare, and so on. And the interesting thing is, they of course came up with a paradigm. Of course, Marxist-Leninism saw the world through a material dialectic, kind of in a Hegelian extraction, that the world is ultimately on a certain destination. And ultimately, in their eyes, of course, it's, the vanguard state for the international workers' paradise, and that ultimately the telos of the world was communism, right? The idea was to establish a dictatorship insofar as to effect equality, and over time, once the world has been taken into the communist and socialist fold, socialism globally, it will finally dissolve into communes and true democracy and true equality, absolutely shorn of hierarchies and all the systems of oppression, blah 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 blah, all the BS, right? Because you and I both know we are sentient and normal beings with souls, right? Unlike communists, and so we understand also that it is an inevitability to create hierarchies. It is inevitable. It's the law of oligarchy, right? This is Pareto and Mosca, 101. It's that not simply individuals are disparate and not simply different in a kind of trivial sense, but in an inferior and superior absolute way. There are some people who are beautiful, strong, 10-inch cock, everything perfect in every sense, and there are people that are truly mangled. And there's a continuum between top and bottom. Of course, you legionaries, you chads, you're the top 10%, baby. I love you. No, just kidding. No, of course I love you, legionaries, but in all seriousness, though, this is what I'm trying to talk about, because ultimately this is the fundamental. You have to parse the ideology from the reality. Okay, we're here to examine the real politic, not to indulge in the ideological fantasies and the mobilizing reason for things, because ideology itself is a form of, let's say, social cultural technology. It's a way of mobilizing and giving coherence to a greater whole. Now, this doesn't matter. Forget about that. That is something we will talk about later, legionaries, in maybe a Politeia transmission. But to return to the point, what was useful about this ideology, this Hegelianism, really, this bastardized Hegelianism, is the idea that we are all part of a unity, and a nation is a unity. We are together, a collective. And prior to that, especially in the autocratic systems or the liberal systems, the classical liberal systems of the 1800s and so on, in the early 1900s, absolute early 1900s, there was a lack of cohesion, total state cohesion, right? And this is where the term totalitarianism comes into play, because it's not merely a top-down phenomenon, it is a holistic phenomenon. This is something that in the West, we, as a culture or whatever, we have a sense of unease and dislike, but do not feel that way, because if you're in the military, that is a totalitarian system, because it is all-encompassing. It gives you mores and social, like an absolute social hierarchy, a social convention. It gives you moral paradigms. It gives you everything from top to bottom, commands and controls and so on, even though you internally, as a small part of the total whole, are an aspect, component part, right? Whether you're a rifleman or logistics guy or motor tow or whatever it may be, intelligence officer, general, whatever, you all are part of a corporeal whole. And this is already alluded to back in antiquity by Plato's Republic. That is his idea. And there are precedents to this system. In fact, it's the most robust system. The reason why we haven't had the reason to develop it, why, frankly, we didn't need to, is because we didn't, like I said, we didn't have a reason, we didn't have any true enemy that could strike us or invade us or conquer us, on top of course, the fact that we are united in our culture, united in our self-understanding, and the space between us and the major powers of the day up until recently was very distant, and so we could afford that kind of buffer. We could afford that kind of largesse in political autonomy, right? So, why is it this important? I think there's a lot of misconstrual of how things are evolving. We talk about, for instance, FPVs in isolation. We talk about C5 ISR in isolation. We talk about, let's say, economic warfare in isolation, and so on. And what we're seeing in the world is the integration of subkinetic, unconventional means, civilian and otherwise, clandestine as well, into a whole of state purpose. And it is first here in this doctrine, published as Soviet military thought, translated by the US Air Force, of course, that the Soviets first envisioned deep battle, right? Because deep battle is not simply the conventional echelons and doctrinal assortment of various different Soviet armed forces, but on top of that was a way to mobilize the people, the politics, the economic sectors into one cogent whole. And of course this lends itself to the command and control system of its economy, which mirrors very closely to a war economy at all times. Now, this is not something you can sustain, as we saw, right? But during wartime, the U.S. actually did something very extremely similar. In fact, that's how we mobilized the entire country towards a whole of state action, a whole of nation action. That's how we were able to succeed. But what is most interesting about the paradigm, and this book is called The Offensive, Soviet Military Thought. It's written by some very interesting guys in the Soviet Stavka, the general staff. It's worth reviewing, even though, of course, the Soviet Union has come and gone. It has left a marker in operational and strategic thought, both on the political level, but also on the military front. And if you've listened to this transmission for long enough, to my various transmissions, you'll know, and this is the case that I've always been making, is that there is no daylight between the military and the political. We made this mistake in the United States. because again, we had this largesse, we had this luxury of distance and safety, but now we're coming to understand, after multiple failed wars abroad, that what is required is that integration. And it is here in the offensive that we're able to see, first, of course, that positing within the framework of Marxist-Leninism, of course. In this sense, I'm not making the case for Marxist-Leninism. Please don't understand that way. But what they did get right, a broken clock, all that shit. Ultimately, what they did get right, legionaries, is the fact that there is a conscious unity of action for a nation to succeed in its national interest, or rather state interest, right? Because some states are international, since, like, for instance, ours. The story of this doctrine is very interesting because ultimately it was written by actually a disgraced, I believe it was a general, and of the Soviet army, and much to his credit, he refused to renege, and because of his interesting backstory, he wasn't necessarily punished, but he was definitely disgraced and kind of internally exiled. His name was Colonel Sidorenko, so of course he wasn't a general, but forgive me for my small deviations in detailed facts. Now, the interesting thing about the offensive is the following. First, it parses, the whole book is aimed at describing, first, setting the stage for how things evolved up into the time this was written, 1986. Later, of course, it talks about a cogent understanding of the offensive in a nuclear environment for the Cold War, the late Cold War especially. Later, he also talks about the various different NATO militaries, their perceptions of us at that time, and so on and so forth. But for the sake of this transmission, what I would like to do, and this is my thesis here, is to show how they examine the trends of warfare and how that itself lends to the transition of warfare into something quite else. And they notice some trends which are becoming even more accentuated to this day. And I would say it's come to a culminating crescendo with perfect ISR, with, basically a synchronicity of combat arms, combined arms warfare, combined political apparatus warfare, and so on. But what is interesting is that they trace this all the way back to the Napoleonic era, using the Russian experience, the military historical experience, to explain how these things will progress into the future. And for as much as it's not necessarily linear, what I would describe this kind of trend, right? And there's like a few different trends which I haven't read yet, and I don't want to leave it to later. But imagine that these trends are highlighted as they emerge from the Napoleonic era and only increase in prominence. So think of like, a basically not asymptotic curve, but a curve that delineates exponential growth, right? So it's just basically an ever-increasing curve which almost becomes entirely linear and vertical over time. Now, there is reason to believe that there will be a technological breakthrough if we were to understand technology as it continues. For instance, there's a Malthusian whatever, and so on and so forth, and it asymptotes out. But everything indicates to this kind of crescendo of technology which completely masters this form of warfare which only emerged, let's say, 200 years ago. 200, a little bit before that, right, legionaries? And so you'll learn this in the War College, you'll learn this in your basic PME and so on, what the Colonel here is going to expound on and elucidate. But I believe it's worthwhile reading the first chapter together. And the reason why is because first we can delve into the paradigm under which they make assumptions. And just like the scientific method, which is kind of machine learning, the Soviets came up, or the communists in general, came up with a vision of the world that saw progress as a cogent whole. And though I don't necessarily believe that's a efficacious model of theory of mind, what I would say is the following, is that it's actually far more useful in coherence of understanding over time, trends over time. And of course, there will be disruptive technologies which come into the future that we don't even know. Who knows? If you ever read Ghost Fleet, it is likely or possible that a lot of this EW power can effectively negate much of the technological evolutions of today. So effectively, we can wipe out ISR. Things can be a lot more difficult to actually pinpoint. So it's not a given that things as they stand now will continue into the future, but as they stand, it indicates towards the trends which this gentleman pointed out in 1986. So without further ado, this is the offensive, and like I said, we'll be going through the first chapter. Chapter 1 is the basic trends in the development of the offensive prior to the appearance of nuclear weapons. Now, the reason why he's so focused on the offensive for the Russians specifically, for as much as they're great in the defensive, and that's what they're known for, right? Whether it's Napoleon or in World War I or World War II, well, not really World War I, but World War II for sure. In effect, they focus on the offensive because the way that their polity is, it's a land-based empire. It has significant, let's say, strategic space within. It's able to retreat into the interior, X, Y, or Z leverage massive populations within its borders to mass mobilization, and the necessity of mass mobilization because, of course, it's one continuous landmass into Europe, into Asia, and so on. This is something that we as Americans don't have, and certainly something that Anglo-Saxon, basically the Anglophonic world as a cultural civilizational sphere doesn't feel. There is some overlap in the continent, but the continent, because of their small polities, decided on a different, more professional, more exquisite, and better, in qualitatively better form of doctrinal organization. Now, it's different. I'm not going to get into that, but what I am going to get into is that the Soviets basically focused entirely on the offensive because they understood that the war of the future would entirely rely on the initiative being on their side because the offensive was favored at the time he was writing. Of course, since then, the advent of ATGM systems and all this kind of smart munition stuff has kind of negated that. We see that with the Russo-Ukraine war, the innovations of smart munitions, proliferation of FPVs, ISR, blah, blah, blah. It kind of favors the defensive. But what is interesting is what he has to say as to how it is that the conventional forces should see themselves as part of a wider effort. Now, going back to how the trends evolved into modern warfare up until his day, right? Going all the way back. So reading now. Marxist-Leninism teaches that no social phenomenon can be understood correctly without a profound study of its past, without clarification of the paths of its development, and without the consideration of it in its ties and interdependency with other phenomena. V.I. Lenin repeatedly stressed that in studying social phenomenon, the most important thing is not to forget the basic historical ties, to look at each question from the point of view of how a certain phenomenon arose in history, what main stages this phenomenon went through in its development, and from the point of view of this development, of it to see what the given thing has now become. So in effect, what he's making the case for in a lot of words is basically Lenin was just simply talking about the idea that the material reality of today, so for instance, smart munitions. Why is it that smart munitions came about? Well, we understood that it's not necessarily mass, but precision of force, Schwerpunkt, basically intensity of combat power in a specific location is just as effective as using 10,000 bombs if one bomb would do the job. Think of a garden hose, for instance. You know how in a garden hose, if you just let it flow out of the hose, it's kind of a more chill, steady pouring of water. But if you put pressure on it and you focus all that same energy, that passive energy, into one focal point, what happens is it shoots out at a parabolic rate, right? Or rather, at a like kind of exponential rate. And so this is what he's trying to make the case for, is that basically what is happening is that these underlying objects of the material reality were gleaned at first, noticed by basically historical happenstance. People understood that's where the center of gravity could be leveraged, and so harnessed it, refined it, and made it more acute. And you see this everything from basically command and control to this, that, and the other thing. And we came to, understand how it is that we can more effectively employ these underlying trends into a more cogent, efficient, and effective whole, effective material, basically, I'd say development, right? So anyway, returning. The Leibniz principle pertains fully to military affairs too. New military art is not born in blank space without any ties with what preceded it. It absorbs within itself a rich historical heritage and everything favorable which was determined in past wars and turned out to be stable. Military theory cannot develop by ignoring the experience of the past, which has been obtained by the efforts and blood of many generations. And so, in effect, what he's making the case for is evolution rather than revolution. So evolution, right? And this is biologically and naturally born out. All of us are the product of evolution, so on and so forth. You build off the blocks which exist prior to us, yet those blocks, over time, they cut off the parts of it that were ineffective, useless, became antiquated, and reinforce those parts which were effective and useful and effectively led to greater evolutions, right? And so this is the same principle applied to military affairs, military technology, military science, and arts. Continuing. And I had to take a swig of my Jim Beam. Sergeant Barnes looking at me all rough and tumble, told him to go freaking exercise the troops or something. Anyway, continuing. Consideration of the combat experience of past wars and the trends in the development of the offensive has tremendous significance in studying modern offensive combat and operations. It goes without saying that the appearance of nuclear missile weapons and other latest armament and combat equipment introduce fundamental changes in the forms and methods of armed conflict. Therefore, we cannot mechanically transfer the experience of past wars to a new situation. This can bring only harm. However, even under these conditions, a profound study of the military experience of the past permits understanding the present better and foreseeing the future, right? So the underlying trends. So remember the Aristotelian idea of the form, right? War has an essence. It changes its form. So it's a unity of concept. Yet war is intelligibly, understandably the same, whether it's waged with spears and shields in the hoplite formation, or it's waged in modern warfare with special forces or economic warfare and so on, right? So effectively what he's saying is ultimately that the material conditions change in such a way that they can't one-for-one be transposed from era to era, but the essential trends can be maintained, examined, and see where they will, trend towards, what they will indicate towards, what the future may favor ever more so or less so. So continuing. Now, the value of military history is noted by the Marshal of the Soviet Union, A. Grenchko. It is the creative perception of the experience and lessons of the past and the capability to disclose the regular laws of the development of methods of the conduct of war. in its boundless capabilities for the expansion of the military world outlook and military thinking of officers and generals. So that's a lot of basically poorly translated Russian, because if you read in Russian, most Russian is very formal. It's actually very rich and deep language. Unfortunately, we've impoverished ourselves because of how common and lingua franca our language has become, and democratic, unfortunately, so it's been lowered in its quality. But that is to say, in simple terms, military history's efficacy is in a historical record of trends over time, the material trends over time, technology, all that good stuff, cultural organization, and so on. I continue. The offensive as a type of combat action of troops appeared together with the emergence of war itself. As human society developed, the methods and forms of the offensive changed continuously and developed. This development represents a regular process which is caused by certain objective prerequisites. It is not the free creativity of the mind of the military leaders of genius, as F. Engels said, and this is Engels, right? Marx, Engels, which operate here in a revolutionary manner, but the level of development of production forces which has been attained, the creation of new means of conflict, and the change in the qualities of the personnel of the army. So what he's making the case is that it is not the genius or the abstraction conjured in the mind of man that actually brings to the fore changes, but rather technological evolution, which naturally lends itself a technological landscape, if you could imagine that, right? It changes the terrain of a certain time, and depending on the development of your state, it may favor one way of warfare over another, depending on its strengths and weaknesses. And this is completely indifferent as to the ideology or stated profession or professed ideology of a state or its people, right? Because it just simply is. It's like saying the technology of a time is akin to, are you in the mountains? Are you in the plains? Are you in the urban setting? Are you in a rural environment? And that, of course, changes the method by which you wage war, because you have to respond to terrains, the asymmetries that proffers, the centers of gravity that naturally proffers, and so on. That same thing applies to technology and everything else. So, continuing. The state of the productive forces of society and the economic capabilities of states have a direct influence on the development of armed forces, which proceed along the line of a continuous growth in the massivity, mobility, and fire and shock power. The centuries-old history of armed conflict, and especially of wars of recent times, confirms this principle. So in effect, more of the same. As I said, as you become more technologically, economically, ideologically advanced, you're able to change the material horizons upon which you wage your conflicts. So, thus, and continuing, thus the largest numerical strength which the army of Gustavus Adolphus succeeded in attaining was 70,000 men. Charles XII, in fighting against Russia, brought his army to 100,000 men, and this figure was tremendous for that time. Napoleon's army, with which he invaded Russia in 1812, numbered 610,000 men. The numerical strength of the French army at the end of the First World War was 5,192,000 men. If in the First World War there were 70 million men in the armed forces of the warring sides, in the Second World War there were 110 million men. The increased mobility and shock action of armies found expression first in the rapid growth of their motorization and mechanization, and the continuous increase in the number of tanks, airplanes, guns, and motor transport amongst the troops. In 1916, the Somme River, for instance, the British employed 49 tanks for the first time. By the end of the First World War, they numbered around 10,000. During the years of the Great Patriotic War, the Soviet Union produced 95,099 tanks and self-propelled artillery mounts. The overall production of tanks in the Second World War in the United States, Great Britain, and Germany from 1939 to 1945, in the USSR from 1941 to 1945, totaled 287,000. The motorization and mechanization of armies is also continuing at the present time. The growth in the fire capabilities of the armies found expression in the continuous increase in the number of firearms of various types among the troops, and first of all, of the artillery, as the main carrier of firepower of the ground troops, as well as in raising its combat effectiveness. In the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-1871, there were 1,720 guns in the Great German Army, and by the end of the First World War, 17,600. In the Great Patriotic War, the Soviet Union had 41,600 mortars, blah, blah, blah. And continuing on, I don't want to waste your time, Legionaries, so what I will say is that in all these specific categories, in mass, mobility, fire, and shock, all of these expanded in importance and prominence on the battlefield, which naturally indicated that they were the centers of gravity and decision which affected the change in the past. And so if you're able to liken this to, let's say, banking, right? There's accounting and financing. This is in effect the purpose of military history is to take accounting, right, and to account for everything that happened, see the general trends, take stock of what happened, and ultimately make forecasts from those trends into the future. Finance. Now, there are things which we can't preempt. We cannot, really, steps of scientific advancement are such that it's like a stepping. It's like a stairwell, right? Each step is a new axiom under which new technology is founded and then fleshed out. If you can imagine, that's the whole flat of a step. What we're finding in our era is that we're getting to the end of this trend arc. Now, we can't preempt what the next step will look like, but we know, hypothetically, that there will be one. And we could probably make assumptions about quantum physics and so on, but I won't even get in there. Long story short, he goes here, and I'm skipping ahead here. The proportion of artillery among the troops also increased sharply. In 1805 to 1806, Napoleon had one gun for every 330 infantrymen. In the First World War, in the armies which were best equipped with artillery, there was now one gun for every 20 to 25 attacking soldiers. And the biggest operations of the Soviet Army in the Great Patriotic War, which is of course Second World War, there was one gun per 4 to 5 attacking soldiers. And this is of course heavy howitzers, field artillery, heavy caliber stuff, not small stuff. In this, the practical rate of fire and range of fire of guns of the basic types in comparison with the guns of the period of Napoleonic Wars increased 10 to 15 times. So basically, the efficacy of this technology exponentially increased 15 times over. And continuing on, it's interesting to note because obviously the Russians have a different historical development. They have different pressures, different experiences, different geography, different people, culture, whatever. And so they mentioned the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905, which was a disaster for the Russians. And ultimately, it underscored the necessity of automatic weapons. So machine guns, all that stuff, which indicated how the First World War would flesh out. Skipping ahead, and this is continuing to read from the text now, an important indicator of the fire capability of the troops is the weight of metal of the units in large units. Its increase can be graphically followed using the example of a motorized rifle division of the Soviet Army, and it's given in a table. I highly recommend buying a copy of this book. I will also be creating a thread so that way you're able to visualize these tables just in case you don't have access, and so you're able to look at this more fleshed out detail. And so returning, during the last 45 years, it has increased more than 150-fold. So literally the weight of this equipment became more large. It became simply with more mass itself in like a physics sense, right? And continuing on, The continuous increasing firepower of the ground troops was intensified by the powerful airstrikes. If up to 1,000 to 1,500 extremely unimproved airplanes participated in the great offensive operations of 1918 and the concluding operations of the Soviet Army in the Great Patriotic War, it amounted to 7,500 which were employed. And of course, 30 million bombs and all of different calibers, which of course were able to create a higher density per square kilometer for each target with increased accuracy and efficacy of combat efficiency. Now, continuing to, skipping forward a little bit, I don't want to read the whole chapter. If you'd like it, like again, this is called The Offensive, Soviet Military Thought. You can find it on Amazon. Reading now. The material base of a war, which in turn depends on the level of development of production, is the number and quality of armament and the personnel in the army, the degree of its mobility, the firepower, and the shock power, which also were those objective factors which had a direct influence on the change in the character, methods, and forms of armed conflict, and in particular, the offensive. In addition, the change in the forms and methods of the offensive are influenced by the nature of the enemy's defense, the organization of the troops, the level of development of military theory, the system for the training and education of troops, the presence of combat experience, and a number of other factors. Decisive jumps and significant qualitative changes in the methods of the offensive were always determined first by changes in the means of conflict and in the people which employ them. In this case, as the productive forces, science, technology developed, the gaps between these jumps became smaller and smaller. And so, like I said, I will have the table uploaded and you're able to reference it yourself, Legionaries, but it shows basically year on year between 1923, the weight of a salvo, for instance, was amounted to 336 kilograms of munition, right? So fires, right, of a howitzer. And in 1968, one could bring to bear 53,000 pounds, or rather kilograms, of a salvo. And so you can see the mass of fire exponentially increased by orders of magnitude from 1923 to 1968, emphasizing the prominence of effectively firepower and fire's density and mass. So continuing on, obviously it continues to talk about the development of feudal warfare to the era of capitalism and all this stuff. I won't bore you. Let's get to the good stuff, right? Let's get to the freaking action. You know what I'm saying? A lot less talk and a lot more action. Let's go. So, continuing to read. In the course of the regular process of development, certain trends were discovered and were often manifested over a long period of time. One of these trends, which was caused by the increase in the combat capabilities of the armies, their fire and shock power, and maneuverability, is the continuous increase in the scope of the offensive. So, in effect, what he's making the case to say is that with the increased capabilities of mobility, maneuverability, and these things are distinct, right? Because mobility is just the ability to, the speed by which you can move. Maneuverability is the cohesive unit level change where you're able to make coordinated strikes and cogent military moves, right? So it's very different. And then, of course, fire and shock. So fire, remember, fire is effectively, explosions, if you can think about it this way. It's effectively indirect fires, if you know, like if you're in the military. But for those of you who don't understand what fires are, it's in effect explosive material, small arms, all that good stuff. It's the firepower that you bring, right? Shock. Now, shock is different. Shock is mass times force. So times speed, really. And what does that mean? It's basically, it's a Lord Slim's firstest with the mostest, right? So it's basically, shock is the ability to show up with as many men as you can and their weapons platforms in such density to overwhelm any one specific sector of the enemy front. All this combined caused a continuous front to form when previously the technology was that it couldn't sustain that. It didn't have a continuous front. What it actually did, it had corps of men that basically traveled in, let's say, armies. And, you know, as you see in the First World War, is one continuous front from, let's say, the lowlands of Flanders all the way down to Switzerland, right? It's one continuous front. So, anyway, in the wars of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century, when the armies of the warring states were comparably small and were armed with smooth-bore weapons, the offensive developed on a front of 6 to 12 kilometers and to a depth of 4 to 6 kilometers. For example, the Battle of Borodino in 1812 was conducted on a front of about 8 kilometers and to a depth of about 6 kilometers. Under these conditions, the conduct of war schematically consisted of a long march over a great distance and a short, usually in the course of one day, battle on a limited terrain sector. The entire army, which represented the armed forces of the state, operated in the battle as a single whole. According to the statement of the military theoretician A. Nesnemov, the army remained in the hands of the emperor as a battalion is in the hands of a good major. In the battle, he commanded it just like a battalion. He himself conducted the reconnaissance, followed the course of the battle personally, and with his own eyes assumed its orders. His marshals were simple executors of the missions assigned them precisely in the battle and administrative assistance on the march. And so ultimately what he's saying is the scope of a state's armed forces were so limited in number and cohesion that it was effectively operating on very small terrain. You know, the sovereign of that state could operate and command and control a battle himself. Continuing, at the beginning of the 20th century, in the connection with the numerical strength of armies and their combat might, the scope of battles increased. Thus, in the Russo-Japanese War, the Battle of Liuliang was initiated on a front of 75 kilometers and lasted for 11 days on the Saki River, and the battle was waged on a front of 90 kilometers and lasted 13 days, and at Mukden on a front of 150 kilometers for 17 days. With the expansion of the front of combat actions to 100 to 150 kilometers, the battle was broken up into a number of centers of conflict. So basically, delegation of command, right? So it became too expansive, and so they broke it down into subordinate commands for their specific sector's operations. With the expansion of the front, blah, 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 it was beyond the capabilities of one general to direct many corps and divisions which were operating on a broad front. Armies were created as permanent operational I don't even know what it's called, but basically operational sectors or operational units, so corps, divisions, and so on, which were given latitude of control for the individual of the most senior officer in command of that unit. They were delegated command down the chain of command, as opposed to being positively controlled, let's say, by Tsar at the Battle of Borodino and so on. Continuing and then basically going all the way through, skipping through a little bit, here we come back to reality, right? And so, in connection with the increase in the overall scope of armed conflict, which was increased by the decisiveness of the goals of the operations and influence on the army on a broad 5 to 700 kilometer front, the Soviet Army was the first to employ a new organizational form of armed conflict during the years of the last war. The offensive operation of several coordinating fronts, right, groups of fronts, from 2 to 4 fronts, participated in numbering 100 to 200 divisions, 20 to 40,000 guns and mortars, 3,000 to 6,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, and up to 7,500 airplanes. Such an operation became the basic form for the conduct of strategic offensive operations of the Great Patriotic War. The war provided many outstanding examples of the operations of the new type, which led to the smashing and rout of strong enemy strategic formations. So he lists all the battles, But just to pause here and talk about Tukhachevsky, right? He was the one who created the concept of the operational level of warfare. So there's the strategic level on top. This is not very okay. So to prepare you legionaries, there are levels of warfare, and if you read MCDP 1, war fighting, you'll understand the following. There are 3 levels of warfare: the strategic, the operational, the tactical. The operational level of warfare did not exist as a conscious domain or theater or subdivision of command before Tukhachevsky. It was Tukhachevsky who saw, over time, with all these different combatant commands effectively becoming too distant from each other to be centralized in its control, command and control, and therefore had to leave a lot of the technical military leadership to the front, or in the Western model, corps commanders, basically discretion, right? So he was basically delegating authority, delegating command rather, and so it was Tukhachevsky that innovated on this, that expounded on this, that basically delegated strategic objectives to the civil political realm, right? So Stalin, let's say, or the president in the United States, and Congress, I suppose. And then it was the military's role to master the practical techniques of whatever combat, combined arms unit they're leading, whether it's a brigade, this or that, or an air wing, and so on. And of course, a front is the combination of combined arms. It has resources such as air wings, armored divisions, infantry divisions, logistical command and control, blah, blah, blah. It's one unitary whole, but a subdivision of the strategic vision of a war's prosecution. Okay? And remember, legionaries, if you have any questions, please, of course, leave it in the transmission notes below. But, returning to the question at hand. So remember, the sections that were being innovated is basically the trends of increased mass, increased maneuverability, increased fires, and the capacity of increased shock. All these trends over time became exponentially more important. They were the centers of gravity of any military force and were the decisive factor in warfare of that time. Now, here's the deal, man. So, of course, we can go through the whole chapter, but I believe it's important to skip over a lot of the abstruse detail. There's a lot of fine, interesting little kind of segues and historical anecdotal evidence to back the thesis of what's happening. A lot of redundancy. Of course, this is important in a exposition and prose. However, let's just get to the basically the good part of this trend, right? Because it's not necessarily self-evident as far as how these things combine and how they manifest. And therefore, this is the outcome and conclusion of the different trends coalescing into a cogent whole and how they affect doctrine as a whole. See, this is the interesting thing. A lot of the U.S. military, the way that we developed the doctrine for airland battle, for instance, was that it was doctrinally mandated, and then the weapon systems came later. However, it does not necessarily imply that this is the correct mode of being. Usually what you do is you progress technologically what's available to you as a nation state in your development, or rather your state development, and then basically you combine them in a kind of orchestra, and it is through those various different instruments you create a new tune, right? I guess more important and so on, or more cohesive. And so anyway, skipping forward a few pages, here we go. The Colonel says, as the experience of the two world wars showed, a direct consequence of the increase in the fire, shock action, and mobility of the armies was the increase in the maneuverability of the combat actions, their decisiveness, activity, and the speed of deployment. The mass employment of tanks, aviation, rocket, and the tube artillery during the wars of the Second World War made possible the overcoming of the positional front and the conduct of active offensive operations on a broad front and to a great depth. At the same time, the increased level of motorization, mechanization of the troops furthered the increase in their maneuverability on the field of battle and the increase in the speed of concentration, regrouping, and movement of reserves forward. Continuing, in the last war, maneuver combat actions had a mutual character. At the same time that the attacker was striving to penetrate deep into the enemy disposition more rapidly, the defender was trying to strengthen his resistance by maneuver and delay and stop the offensive. In turn, the attacker countered these attempts with the maneuver of forces and means. Thus, the offensive as well as the defense represented, in essence, the aggregate of a number of maneuver actions, and the significance of which increased more and more for the attainment of success, and the conditions for execution became complicated. So, in effect, the added speed, mobility, and mass of warfare added to the complexity of warfare, making things more difficult, right? Obviously. And the maneuver character of the combat actions and decisiveness of the goals of the warring sides caused the frequent arising of meeting engagements and battles. If in the First World War meeting engagements and battles arose only during its maneuver period, as a rule, with the clash of enemies on the march, then in the Great Patriotic War, which was primarily a war of maneuver, they arose during the course of the entire war and at all stages of the conduct of offensive operations. This was explained by the fact the reserves of the sides became highly mobile and were employed by the accomplishment of active missions with decisive goals, in contrast to the First World War, where they were used primarily to seal the defensive front and localize breakthrough, or to replace, they use a Russian term, I won't even pretend to pronounce it, which had lost their combat efficiency. And so, in effect, it's really important to understand the distinction between positional warfare and maneuver warfare. Positional warfare, for those of you who don't know, it's in effect fighting for military objectives which do not have decisive outcome. It's inherently, obviously, defensive. It's mutually supporting. The idea is to have a coherent, cohesive line, defense in depth, blah, blah, blah. That was the defining characteristic of the First World War, and to basically, for those of you who are, following the Russo-Ukraine war, ultimately it's the same thing. It's a positional war, right? Maneuver warfare is a warfare which emphasizes decisive action. And it's less playing for terrain features, basically occupying militarily advantageous terrain, and instead focusing on closing with and destroying, by fires and maneuver, enemy forces. Many of you know or are aware of the German Blitzkrieg. I will not get into it. I know that the Germans didn't call it Blitzkrieg. I don't care. The colloquial term for it is Blitzkrieg, and it's an awesome word. So legionaries, we will use it. The idea was, for the Germans, they were facing a numerically superior enemy, and on paper, the parity of motorized and mechanized troops and armored troops was the same. And so what they decided to do was, in effect, choose to concentrate forces at the decisive point, break through, envelop, and basically destroy pockets of enemy resistance by either fires and closing with the enemy, or surrendering or impelling them to surrender. Now, that is the defining feature of the Second World War, And it is interesting because, of course, the Russians are creating this offensive doctrine, and much of their doctrine, which survived it after the Second World War, from this basically this trauma that they had because they were waging a positional war, and had to come to grips with the fact they needed a defensive depth to be able to counter the pincer movements of maneuver warfare, which is very interesting because it's strange how the Soviet guy was perceiving himself, his own military experience, or rather the military culture of the Soviet military, as a primarily motorized maneuver element. But we'll see that there is a caveat, and this is where a deep battle comes into play, right? So continuing on, and I fast forward here a little bit. Favorable conditions for the conduct of maneuver actions and the development of the offensive in the depth and the rooting of the basic enemy formations in 2 world wars was created as a rule only after the breakthrough. The increase in firepower, the increase in the mobility of the reserves, and the improvement of the art of engineer improvement of terrain permitted the defender to create a strong defense quickly. Therefore, although the fire and shock capabilities of the attacker continuously increased, the breakthrough of the enemy defensive front was always a more difficult and more important stage of the offensive. If, for some reason, the breakthrough could not be accomplished, then the entire offensive operation died down regardless of how well the subsequent stages for its development were worked out and thought through. In the course of the 2 world wars, the tendency to accomplish the breakthrough simultaneously on several directions was clearly determined. And so what he's saying is this, right? So just to make it, break it down Barney style, right? The idea that he's saying is that ultimately he gleaned the German experience where offensives failed, especially, for instance, the Battle of Kursk, right? Where offensives failed and there was a concentration of force, what that caused was a loss of initiative, a loss of developing the front into a positive environment, basically balance of forces. Because, of course, the most important element of winning any battle, whether tactical or strategic, is maintaining the initiative. And remember, the initiative is basically putting the enemy on the defensive. I think that's the most basic way of saying it, right? Keeping on the offensive, making the enemy react to you. That's what's called retaining the initiative. And so if you have that, you basically have the positive aggressive posture, which will allow you over time to succeed with victory. This is something that's very interesting because attrition warfare does not emphasize this point, but this is the point that he's trying to make in regards to maneuver warfare. So if we skip forward a little bit, and to remind you, of course, the idea that the Germans would have basically limited thrusts, echelons of armored spearheads that would go through, right? He understood that that wasn't enough, and that was the Soviet experience. That was how they were able to overcome the Germans later on. Of course, the Lend-Lease from the Americans were able to flesh out those divisions and were able to feed them and so on, but all things being equal, what he came to understand is the following, and this is what he's going to say. With the establishment of a continuous positional front in the First World War, the high command of all armies initially considered a breakthrough may be accomplished only on one narrow sector of the front, right, like this Somme, right, by means of a strong strike at one point. This idea was reflected most clearly in the directive of the Commander-in-Chief of the French Army, Joffre, of 29 November 1914, in the situation and this is Joffre now, General Joffre. In the situation that has developed, the general offensive of all armies simultaneously, wrote Joffre, is possible only from the moment when we break through the enemy disposition by a strong blow at one point. By this, we force him to a gradual evacuation of the front. Now, what the colonel is saying, this is a incorrect outcome, and this is what led to the bloodshed of World War I. The absurd and gratuitous loss of life that was it just destroyed Europe. Frankly, World War I was more catastrophic to Europe than World War II. If anything, the best way to understand World War II is in effect a continuation of the First World War. But I digress. I don't want to get into politics and philosophy in this transmission. Returning to military affairs. The strong aspect of this form of breakthrough consisted of the fact that it permitted the maximum massing of forces and means in creating decisive superiority over the enemy on a selected direction. However, experience show that the launching of a blow on one direction and passivity on the remaining front, the attainment of the secrecy of preparation of the operation was hindered by the defender had the opportunity to adapt to his measures. He quickly determined the direction of the enemy's strike, transferred reserves and troops there which were taken from unattacked sectors, and localized the breakthrough. In addition, with the defender was facilitated by the possibility of firing through this sector with effective artillery fire and creating a compact defense in short times. Therefore, the breakthrough on one narrow sector with passivity on the remainder of the front, as a rule, did not lead to success. Boom. And of course he goes through the various details of how it didn't work and this and that and the other thing. But let me just return to, basic Barney style. What he's saying is this idea of one concerted, if you have basically a line of contact, right, with the enemy. If you place all your troops in preparation for offensive at one sector, it will be met with basically asymmetry of defensive forces who can basically preempt your concentration of forces and redeploy to the sector that is being threatened with the attack. And he's saying that as a rule, this led to defeat. It led to either defeat, a Pyrrhic victory, or the complete loss of the initiative of the offensive front. And this is what defined the First World War for a very long time, until the very, very end. And so, basically, continuing through, just to surmise the following pages, he goes through the experience of the Eastern Front in World War I, where the character of battle was substantially different, due to the fact that the expanse of distances was far greater. The Russian forces were far more disparate. The line of contact was a lot harder to maintain, and therefore war of maneuver gained prominence and decision. And this is where, of course, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in 1917 was actuated, and so the war in the East came to a close, and finally all those German troops and Austro-Hungarian troops could redeploy to the Western fronts. Very interesting. And ultimately, the most important outcome is basically the idea that the offensive, to be successful, had to be attacked, had to be not simply conduct diversionary shaping operations, but also multiple simultaneous spearheads, which each would be or take on a transitory, let's say, main effort emphasis, right? So remember, there's a main effort and a supporting elements, right? Supporting efforts. And so ultimately, it became the case that offensives all through the front had to be conducted simultaneously, and it was at the points which there were breakthroughs that breakthrough area, sector, became, in effect, the area which became the main effort, right? So basically, it was a transition from one single point of attack to multiple, and seeing how that ultimately leads to overall operational success. Now, of course, he goes into the various different, basically, improvements in technology of basically automatic weapons, the volume of fire. It's not just, howitzers, volume of fire and mechanized warfare, but also small arms, munitions, and all the effects that has onto basically the combat units, their dispersion, but also most importantly, the manifestation of combat efficiency. With the increased complexity, mobility, and let's say accuracy, concentration of fires, what this led to is in effect fires in depth, right? So defense in depth to recuperate, offenses in depth, as well as everything else in between. Now, I'm going to stop reading from the book because now is the time for the analysis, right? If you extrapolate out what this means, especially since World War II and the Cold War, what you start to understand is the necessity of mass mobilization, the necessity of high industry, policies which obviously aid both, and the conscious decision to safeguard aspects or, let's say, the prime defense industries, or rather war industries, necessary to both preserve your own sovereignty and enforce your will upon the world as a state. So, that's very interesting, and this is just a conventional trend. But if you can see inherently, implicitly in these trends, is of course everything that feeds into all of these necessities which are required to wage modern warfare, which is obviously the ability to have command and control staff, mass mobilization, like I said, a cogent ideology worth fighting for, morale, and so on, psychological ability, not simply defense in depth, but penetration in depth. And it's not simply in a conventional sense, but also, if, just as Clausewitz said, the whole point of war is the transference of kinetic aims, right, in a conventional sense, to a political outcome. So Hannibal is renowned for gaining a mania battle, but not knowing how to win a war. And so here's the challenge, and here's the the point that I'm trying to make, is that the advent of all these trends, and then of course after this effect, so the Great Patriotic War, the Second World War, and then later the Cold War with the introduction of nuclear arms, and then of course the strong intelligence clandestine service which sprouted out, especially with special forces and so on, to make its foreign policy felt in lieu of conventional arms to enforce one's will. And so what happens is that you start to understand that the trends which emerged early on in the 1800s and so on gave way to the need for an integral whole of state recruitment, both technologically, economically, socially and culturally, as well as the conventional forces that I'm sure you young soldiers, young legionaries, are well aware of. So just to further extrapolate out, and if we can kind of traverse the, let's say, the dunes of time and come back to the present era, we have come to see trends in communication. And as I said, those complexities of organization, that high mobility of forces, gave way and the need to decentralize command, but in effect also quicken the pace of communications and meaningful understanding of how the battlefield is, and to synthesize facts as they emerge. Hence why today we have C5ISR. And to quickly define what C5ISR, for those of you who don't know, it's in effect this. It's command, control, computers, communication, cyber, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. It's in effect the recruitment of all the sensors and nodes and command nodes and decision-making centers of an entire host synthesized, so that way you're aware of everything that's happened on the battlefield, from the strategic vision, operational, and tactical, whether it's superior elements, supporting elements, whether it's to your left or your right, constituent elements, and so on. And this is actually where we start to see the innovation take place, and the precedence and the necessity of the recruitment of the state. There's this great thread that I made from a book that was, or rather, of course it's a great thread, but it's a great book. and it's called The Kill Chain. And this book talks about effectively the experience of, or rather, it's 5 Seconds to Die is the book, and the experience of the Azerbaijani Armenian War that recently broke out over Nagorno-Karabakh region, and ultimately the side that was able to mobilize, have a cogent, consistent program of military effort, which was combined with state and economic efforts, right, was victorious on the battlefield. Long gone are the days where we are able to parse the civilian from the military. These are false distinctions. And of course, as I keep on harping in general, the PRC is able to leverage civilian and government resources, economic resources, to have, in effect, military supporting effects or military outcomes without the necessity of conventional kinetic engagements. And so the reason why I'm bringing this to your attention and why it's important to understand this at core is that, first, 2 things. One, that the necessity for whole of state, military civil fusion will become self-evident. This is something that China is pioneering in our time, and it's something I think we are too disunited, and the form of government that we naturally have is too let's say diffuse to have a cogent not simply war effort but also a peacetime effort. And that is the Achilles heel of the American Republic, is because we are so entrenched in liberal paradigms that we are constantly coming up against subkinetic or subconventional belligerent actions. For instance, economic warfare, intelligence, and all this good stuff, that we're starting to finally understand that there is no such thing as peace and war. Those 2 things are a facet of the past, especially in a globalized world. Of course, there are many ways to skin a cat. I mean, you sure could balkanize the internet, stop immigration, and you could effectively wall off the world and preserve your domestic union as it stands, which is unlikely. Or you can do the opposite, and you can effectively integrate this system of governance so that way you can meaningfully, robustly, and dynamically respond to challenges which the previous liberal paradigm is not able to meet or affect or respond in an effective way. And so, secondarily, this is the outcome that I think is important. Ultimately, regarding how we analyze trends as they develop, how it is that these things affect the world, do have a real material effect. That is to say, it affects us ourselves as to our political, technological calculus, and it widens the scope of what is necessarily military, and it defines and reveals the military nature. Because this is a mistake in the West that we make, is that the military is relegated to the techniques of warfare, but without the political acumen to understand the effects of military objectives, and therefore we set military objectives which have no political outcome, hence wars such as GWOT and so on. So, what I'm trying to gird you with, legionaries, is the vision that you have to see holistically. You have to go into military history with the aim of discerning these trends and understanding where this leads to. And of course, this is not to say that the future won't be pregnant with different circumstances which call for different solutions, right? But we must be dynamic in our time. Should it be the case that we want a republic to be strong, or rather our empire, the West itself to be strong and not tyrannized and subordinate, and therefore we must broaden the scope of military studies to the political, to the economic, to the clandestine, and so on. This is the purpose of understanding military history, for it is also a scientific understanding of reality. And that's what I mean by the one mechanism or paradigm of analysis that Marxist-Leninism, or whatever you want to call it, does offer to the West, which we are completely, let's say, incapable of doing, right? It brings a cogent total picture. You're able to intuit solutions which otherwise would be mystifying to us. So we'd read widely, be obviously skeptical, and understand this: for as much as material outcomes do matter, the terrain matters, weapons platforms, doctrine, and so on, you have to remember that ultimately the center of all action is agency, discipline, and the will to win. Without further ado, Legionaries, I'm going to leave you with that transmission. This is General Lance and Sergeant Barnes, and this is the episode of Technica, signing off.